Heading into the 2011 season, the gauntlet had been laid down for the Houston Texans. It was playoffs or bust. And if they didn't make the playoffs, Gary Kubiak was going to be shown the door, and there might be some wholesale changes made to the Texans roster. Well, they made the playoffs in 2011, won the division. They came back again in 2012 and did the exact same thing, this time going 12-4 and finishing first in the AFC South, and made it to the divisional round before losing to New England. They hold the 27th overall pick in this upcoming April's NFL Draft. When you look at this Texans organization, an expansion team that's been around now for, in 2013, will be their 12th season of existence, things definitely look a lot better than they did a decade ago, to the point where the Texans are the type of team that have a certain window of opportunity to try and win a championship. That's what they're built for. They're built to win right now. The problem with this team, I think, is that that window of opportunity may close on them a lot quicker than they may realize. When you look at their season on the offensive side of the ball, Schaub threw for 4,000 yards and had 22 touchdown passes, which wasn't a great total, but he also only had 12 interceptions. But in general, I think there were times, especially later on in the season, where Schaub was less than spectacular, and flat out at times he looked very mediocre. As opposed to earlier in the season, at times he looked very, very good. And Schaub sometimes is a frustrating guy to watch because you look at him, he's a strong-armed, big, tall pocket passer that seems to have the ability to make every NFL throw, and at times demonstrates his ability to make every NFL throw, and at times it looks like a top 7 or 8 quarterback in the league. But then there are other times where he reminds you why he was a third-round pick in that 2004 draft and why the Atlanta Falcons never really gave him the shot to be their long-term answer at quarterback. He's frustrating to watch at times, as is this Texans team occasionally. Arian Foster is an absolute beast. He had another monster year, 1,400-plus yards rushing, 15 touchdowns, and he's a good weapon to have in the passing game. Arian Foster, from being an undrafted player to being arguably one of the 3 best running backs in all of the NFL. It's a nice success story. Andre Johnson came back from a less than stellar 2011, which was impacted significantly by injury, and he had 112 catches for 1,598 yards, but only 4 touchdowns. The offense for the Texans finished 8th in the league in points per game, 7th in total yards, 11th in passing yards, and 8th in rushing yards. So this is an offense that you look at that at times looks elite, but is more in that very good category and has those games, and did especially late in the season and even in the playoffs, where they didn't look so hot, basically. Now we flip to the defensive side of the ball. And, of course, when you talk about the Houston Texans defensively, it begins, middles, and ends with J.J. Watt. This guy is a freaking beast. Playing in a 3-4 defense, had 20.5 sacks. I believe he had something like 75 or 80 or even maybe a little more total tackles. And not even to mention how many passes deflected he had. I mean, he is just phenomenal at that. When he doesn't think he can get to the quarterback, he stops and he jumps and he gets his hand up and knocks down a shit ton of balls at the line of scrimmage. Easily the defensive player of the year in the NFL this year, and really spearheaded a pretty good Texans defense overall. And this is even with them losing a Brian Cushing to injury very early in the year. They finished 10th in points allowed, 7th in total yards allowed, and 7th in rushing yards allowed. Their secondary was a little bit better. It's definitely not the strength of their defense, but they had made some improvements. And it also helps when you've got a guy like J.J. effing Watt getting 20.5 sacks. This was a team that could get to the quarterback on a somewhat consistent basis. And when you look at the Texans, like I said again, this is a team that is built to try and win championships right now. And their window of opportunity, I believe, is maybe only 1 or 2 more seasons. And one of the reasons, when you look at guys like J.J. Watt, etc., one of the reasons that they're in this position, I truly believe, is because of their recent history in the NFL Draft. Now, it definitely doesn't hurt for the Texans in terms of their success the past 2 seasons in particular that they have holdovers like Andre Johnson, their first-round pick in 2003, or the trade they made several years back to get Matt Schaub. But in general, they've done a lot of things well in recent years in the NFL Draft. They've had plenty of first-round successes, such as Dwayne Brown, who's an absolute stud as a left tackle, Brian Cushing, need I say more. Kareem Jackson, I think, is starting to come in his home at least a little bit. He's probably the least significant of the last 5 first-round picks. J.J. Watt, what more needs to be said? But even Whitney Mercilus, the outside linebacker from Illinois, showed some flashes of being a real edge-rushing force on the outside in that 3-4 defense. But just as important as the success of those first-round picks have been for the Houston Texans, it's the value that they find in the middle and later rounds. The guys like Ben Jones and Jared Crick and Ben Tate and Glover Quinn and James Casey and Garrett Graham. Hell, looking back to, I believe, 2008, an undrafted running back named Arian Foster is now one of the best running backs in the entire league. When you get that type of value in the middle and late portions of the draft, when you hit on your first-round picks and you even find occasional gems like Arian Foster basically on the scrap heap, it's not hard to figure out why a team eventually is going to have some success. Now, they may not have that one last ingredient or that one last it factor that they need, in my opinion, at this moment to win a Super Bowl right now, but they really are one of those teams that is definitely in the mix, and if one or two things goes right, they could very well make it there, no question about it. And in large part, that is due to the strength of the Texans' front office and their performance in the NFL draft over the past several years. Now, as I've mentioned earlier in this video more than once, the Texans, to me, are a team that is built to win now, but also has a narrow window of opportunity to do that. Maybe no more than 2, if I'm stretching it, maybe 3 years. Maybe. That's just kind of the way I look at this team. Schaub's not the youngest spring chicken. Andre Johnson's not the youngest spring chicken. They have some big-time players on that team, and, Arian Foster, God bless him, he's not going to be there forever either. Like I said, a 2-year window, maybe a 3-year window to potentially bring a Super Bowl to Houston. And with that being said, this 2013 draft for the Texans should be utilized to find that 1 or 2 last pieces or those missing ingredients that could help put this team over the top and take them from being a Super Bowl pretender or mid-contender to being a prohibitive favorite potentially to take the Lombardi Trophy next year. The one flaw in the logic of the Texans over the past several years, and for many years in my opinion, is the reliance on Kevin Walter to be their number 2 wide receiver opposite Andre Johnson. Kevin Walter is a good NFL wide receiver. He is not a very good or great wide receiver. Now, it helps. They've been able to mask this at times because of the play of Owen Daniels at tight end. He's a great pass catcher, and he's a great threat over the middle of the field that causes some mismatch problems for opposing defenses. But as the league has started to go to more and more spread looks where you have 3 or 4 legit weapons on the outside, the problem for the Texans offensively, in my opinion, is that they have Andre Johnson, they have Owen Daniels, and they really don't have anybody else that really makes you fearful as an opposing defense. There's nobody else you really have to worry about or game plan for. You can pretty much play them one-on-one. Maybe there are moments where a James Casey or a Garrett Graham has a nice game, but it's not on a consistent basis. They invested a couple of picks on the wide receiver position in this past draft with Deviar Posey and Keyshawn Martin. And these are guys that potentially could be contributors on the offensive side of the football, but you don't look at either one of them and see anything more as slot contributors. They don't have that look of being a number 1 or number 2 wide receiver on the outside, a big play target, basically. And for years, the Texans have avoided this. They have ignored this glaring need on their team, in my opinion. And when you look at this 2013 NFL draft, this is a draft class where you might not have that one A.J. Green or Julio Jones type of receiver necessarily, but there is good talent available at the position, in particular where the Texans will be drafting at number 27. If I could ever implore an organization to ignore the best player available regardless of position and to focus on one particular position with their first-round picks, it's this year the Houston Texans with wide receiver. They have to do it, whether that be DeAndre Hopkins, Terrence Williams, if they like a guy like Tavon Austin even, who's not necessarily somebody I would rely upon to be a number 2 on the outside all time, but a great playmaker out of the slot, thinking like a Percy Harvin or a Randall Cobb, or maybe a guy like a Robert Woods is more of your flavor, whatever the case might be. You could sit there and make an argument, maybe they need to improve the interior of their line a little bit, or right tackle, and bring in a guy like Barrett Jones or a DJ Fluker, or maybe they need some depth alongside Brian Cushing inside linebacker and go for a guy like Kevin Minter or Monte Teo or Arthur Brown. These are guys that would definitely come in and have an impact on the football team, but they have to go wide receiver here with this first round. And I could even argue go wide receiver in the first round and then maybe again in the 3rd or 4th round. You have a small window of opportunity. The Texans flat out need more weapons on the offensive side of the football, in particular in the passing game. It'll help better protect Schaub, give him more options. It'll help free up Andre Johnson with the remaining time he has left in the league. It'll also potentially open up some even bigger running holes for Arian Foster and Ben Tape in the running backs in the Texans offense. You look at it too, Andre Johnson is not a spring chicken, and God bless him, someday he's probably going to have a bust in Canton. I love Andre Johnson. But you could start to see maybe the decline is slowly going to happen. And not only do the Texans not have a potential number one in-house, in my opinion, they don't even have a real potential number two in-house. And if there's anything that they do in this draft, they must, and I emphasize this again for Texans fans, must address the number two wide receiver position first and foremost. You could find inside linebackers or offensive linemen in the middle rounds of the draft, a place where the Texans have been very successful the past several years. But they have to invest a first-round pick in that wide receiver position. If they do, and they get a guy that's a big-time playmaker that could serve as a Julio Jones type to Andre Johnson's Roddy White type, so to speak, if you get the analogy, you're talking about an offense that goes to a whole different level and a team that could potentially win the Super Bowl in the 2013 season.